The silent arrival. The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly across the vast expanse of Samuel Creek's ranch, casting long shadows from the mesa formations that dotted the horizon. The year was 1952, and the drought had been relentless for 3 months straight. Samuel wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he mended the fence line near his property's eastern border, the metal wire burning hot in his calloused hands. At 42, Samuel had grown accustomed to solitude. His wife Martha had passed 2 winters ago from pneumonia, leaving him alone on the 1,000-acre spread with only his cattle and the endless sky for company. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and the small town of Copper Ridge was a dusty hour's ride on horseback. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made him look up from his work. Sheriff Tom Bradley emerged from the heat shimmer, his badge glinting in the harsh light. Behind him rode Dr. Eleanor Hayes from the Indian Agency, her usually composed face marked with concern. Between them, on a paint horse that clearly wasn't hers, sat a young Apache girl. Samuel set down his tools and walked toward them, dust kicking up with each step. The girl couldn't have been more than 16, her long black hair hanging like a curtain across her face. Her traditional dress was torn and stained, and even from a distance, Samuel could see the defiance in her rigid posture. Afternoon, Sam Sheriff Bradley called out, dismounting near the water trough. His horse immediately lowered its head to drink. "We've got ourselves a situation here." Dr. Hayes dismounted with practiced efficiency, her khaki field clothes practical against the desert environment. "Mr. Crick, I know this is highly irregular, but we need your help." Samuel nodded toward the girl, who remained mounted, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the horizon. "What's her story?" "Found her 3 days ago near the old mining camp," the sheriff explained, removing his hat to wipe his forehead. "Looks like she's been on her own for weeks, maybe longer. Won't speak a word of English. Won't give us her name. Won't even acknowledge we're talking to her." Dr. Hayes stepped closer, lowering her voice. "The reservation's overcrowded, and frankly, they don't have resources for someone who won't cooperate with their programs. The Indian school won't take her without proper documentation, and we can't force her to identify herself." Samuel studied the girl more carefully. Despite her silence, he could see intelligence in her dark eyes, and something else, a deep, abiding grief that he recognized all too well. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he already knew. "She needs somewhere to stay while we figure out her situation," Dr. Hayes said. "Somewhere she can feel safe enough to start talking. You've got the space." And she paused, choosing her words carefully. "You understand what it's like to lose everything." The girl finally turned her head slightly, and for a brief moment, her eyes met Samuel's. In that instant, he saw not defiance but exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of someone who had been carrying an unbearable weight for far too long. The desert wind picked up, rattling the mesquite bushes and sending a dust devil spinning across the corral. Samuel's cattle lowed in the distance, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the isolation they all felt. "I've got a spare room in the house," Samuel heard himself saying. "Used to be Martha's sewing room. It's got a good window facing east, the morning light." Dr. Hayes exhaled with visible relief. "This is temporary, you understand. Just until we can locate her family or find appropriate placement." Samuel nodded, but his eyes remained on the girl. She had turned away again, but her shoulders had relaxed slightly, as if some tension had eased. "What should I call her?" Samuel asked. "That," the sheriff shrugged. "That's the problem. She won't tell us her Apache name, and she doesn't seem to have an English one. The folks at the mining camp just called her the girl." Samuel felt a surge of anger at the casual dismissal. Everyone deserved a name, deserved to be seen as more than just the girl. He approached the paint horse slowly, speaking in the calm tone he used with spooked cattle. "You hungry?" he asked, looking up at her. "I've got stew on the stove, and there's fresh bread from yesterday." For the first time, the girl looked directly at him. Her expression remained guarded, but Samuel caught a flicker of interest, or perhaps just hunger. "I'll take that as a yes," he said, extending his hand toward the horse's reins. "Come on down. This is your home now, at least for a while." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the girl finally dismounted. She stood uncertainly beside the horse, her bare feet stirring the dust. Clearly exhausted, but still wary, Dr. Hayes and Sheriff Bradley prepared to leave, promising to check back in a few days. As their horses disappeared into the gathering dusk, Samuel found himself alone with a stranger who carried secrets he couldn't begin to imagine. "Well," he said, more to himself than to her, I guess we'll figure this out together. The girl followed him toward the ranch house, maintaining a careful distance. The adobe structure had been built to withstand the desert's extremes, its thick walls keeping the interior cool during the day and warm through the cold desert nights. Martha's flower garden had long since withered, but the wooden porch still offered welcome shade. As they reached the front door, Samuel paused. The girl had stopped walking and was staring at something beyond the house, the small cemetery plot where Martha lay buried, marked by a simple wooden cross and a pile of carefully arranged stones. Understanding passed between them without words. Loss, grief, the weight of carrying on when everything familiar had been stripped away. Yeah, Samuel said quietly. I know that feeling too. Building trust through small gestures. The first week passed in careful, silent observation. The girl whom Samuel had begun thinking of simply as her, in his mind, accepted the small room, with its eastern window, but rarely emerged except for meals. She ate sparingly, always watching the doors, and never turned her back to him completely. Samuel had lived alone long enough to appreciate quiet. But this silence felt different, heavy with unspoken trauma. He found himself talking more than he had in months, narrating his daily routines, as if she might find comfort in the predictable rhythm of ranch life. Cattle need checking twice a day in this heat, he explained on the fourth morning, his voice carrying across the breakfast table. Morning and evening, when the temperature's bearable. Lost 3 head last summer to heatstroke, before I learned that lesson. She sat across from him, methodically eating the scrambled eggs he'd prepared, her movements economical and precise. Everything about her suggested someone who had learned not to waste not food, not energy, not trust. The breakthrough came unexpectedly on a Thursday evening. Samuel was repairing a bridle in the living room, when he heard a sound from the kitchen, not quite crying, but something close to it. He found her standing at the window, staring out at the desert where storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by the low rumble of thunder. The girl's whole body tensed, and Samuel realized she was terrified of the approaching storm. First summer storm of the season, he said casually, not approaching but making his presence known. They can be pretty spectacular out here. Lots of lightning, but usually more show than substance. She turned to look at him, and for the first time, he saw genuine fear in her eyes, rather than the guarded wariness she usually displayed. You want to watch from the porch, he offered. Sometimes the best way to face something scary is to look at it head on. To his surprise, she nodded. They sat on the wooden porch chairs Martha used to love, watching the storm approach across the desert floor. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and creosote. Lightning painted the sky in brilliant white streaks, and thunder rolled across the landscape like a freight train. The girl gripped the arms of her chair, but she didn't flee. Samuel found himself talking about storms, how they formed, why the lightning seemed to dance, how the desert desperately needed the rain they might bring. Martha used to say storms were just nature's way of cleaning house, he said, getting rid of the dust and heat, making room for new growth. When the rain finally came, it arrived in a sudden downpour that drummed on the metal roof and turned the dust to mud. The girl relaxed visibly, and Samuel noticed she was watching the rain with something like wonder. Beautiful, isn't it? He said. Powerful, but beautiful. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw her lips move slightly. No sound emerged, but he was certain she had almost spoken. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the air clean and cool. As they prepared to go inside, the girl paused and placed her hand briefly on Samuel's arm, the first time she had voluntarily touched him. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. They were the first English words she had spoken since her arrival. The next morning brought subtle changes. She emerged from her room earlier, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. She still didn't speak, but she watched him with less suspicion and more curiosity. It was while he was shoeing his horse that she surprised him again. He was struggling with a particularly stubborn horseshoe when small hands appeared beside his, holding the horse's hoof steady with practiced skill. You know horses, he observed, looking up at her. She nodded, then demonstrated how to position the shoe more effectively. Her technique was different from his, but clearly effective, the kind of knowledge that came from growing up around horses. Rather than learning from books, they worked together in companionable silence, and Samuel found himself grateful for the help. It had been a long time since he'd had a partner in the daily tasks of ranch life. That evening, as they sat down to another quiet dinner, Samuel made a decision that had been forming in his mind for days. I can't keep calling you her in my head, he said gently. And you deserve better than being called the girl. Would it be all right if I gave you a name to use while you're here? Just temporarily. Until you're ready to share your real one. Ch set down her fork and studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine his intentions. I was thinking, Dawn, he continued, because you always sit by that eastern window in the mornings, watching the sun come up. And because, ... He paused, searching for the right words. Because you're starting something new here. A new chapter. She considered this, her expression, thoughtful. Finally she nodded once. A small but definite acceptance. Dawn it is. Then, Samuel said. And was rewarded with what might have been the ghost of a smile. Over the following days, he began using the name naturally, and she responded to it without hesitation. More importantly, she began to engage more actively in ranch life. She helped with the horses, showing an intuitive understanding of their behavior. She gathered eggs from the chickens with gentle efficiency. She even began preparing some of the meals, introducing Samuel to combinations of desert plants he had never considered edible. One evening, as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Dawn spoke again. My grandmother taught me about plants, she said, her voice stronger than before. Which ones heal, which ones feed, which ones can kill. Samuel nodded, understanding that she was sharing something precious, connection to family, to culture, to a life that existed before whatever tragedy had brought her to his ranch. She sounds like a wise woman, he said. Dawn's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. She was the past tense, hung between them, heavy with implication. Samuel didn't push for details, but he understood that Dawn's silence hadn't been defiance, it had been grief so profound that words seemed inadequate to contain it. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Samuel realized that in trying to help Dawn find her voice, he had begun to find his own again. The ranch no longer felt quite so empty, and for the first time since Martha's death, he looked forward to tomorrow, sharing stories and building connection 3 weeks into Dawn's stay. The summer heat reached its peak intensity. The days stretched, long and brutal, forcing most activity into the early morning and evening hours. It was during these cooler periods that Samuel and Dawn's conversations began to deepen, moving beyond the practical concerns of ranch life into more personal territory. Transformation had been gradual but unmistakable. Dawn now moved through the ranch house with quiet confidence, her bare feet silent on the wooden floors. She had taken over most of the cooking, combining Samuel's basic supplies with wild plants she gathered during their morning rides. Her meals were unlike anything he had ever tasted, complex, nourishing, and infused with knowledge passed down through generations. It was over one such dinner, as they ate a stew made with desert sage and wild onions, that Dawn first volunteered information about her past. The mining company came in the spring, she said without preamble, her voice steady but her eyes fixed on her bowl. They said they had papers, government papers that gave them the right to dig. Samuel set down his spoon, recognizing the weight of what she was sharing. Outside, the evening cicadas had begun their chorus, filling the silence with their rhythmic song. Our village was small, Dawn continued. Maybe 30 families. We had been there for longer than anyone could remember. My grandmother said her grandmother's grandmother was born there, beside the same spring we used for water. She paused, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Samuel waited, understanding that this story needed to emerge at its own pace. The papers said we had to move to the reservation by the end of summer. But my grandmother, she was old and sick. She couldn't travel that far, not in the heat. We asked for more time, just until the weather cooled. Dawn's voice caught slightly, but she continued. They said no. They said the blasting would start whether we were there or not. Samuel felt a cold anger settle in his chest. He had heard similar stories before, the relentless march of progress trampling over people who had nowhere else to go. What happened? He asked gently. My grandmother died 3 days before we were supposed to leave. My mother said we couldn't abandon her body, couldn't leave her alone in the desert, so we stayed to do the ceremonies properly, to send her spirit home. Tears began to track down Dawn's cheeks, but her voice remained steady. The dynamite. They started blasting the day after the deadline. They said they thought everyone had left. They said it was an accident. Samuel's hands clenched into fists. How many? 12 people, including my mother and my little brother. Dawn's voice broke on the last words. I was gathering firewood up in the canyon when it happened. When I came back. She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Samuel could see the devastation in her eyes, the weight of survivor's guilt that he recognized from his own experience with loss. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "I'm so damn sorry." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of her story settling between them. Finally, Samuel spoke again. "How long ago?" "2 months," Dawn said. "Maybe a little more." Time got strange after that. Samuel understood. Grief had its own timeline, its own way of warping the ordinary passage of days and weeks. "Where did you go?" "After, I tried to find other family, but ... double quotes." She shrugged helplessly. "The reservation people said I needed papers, documents. They said without proof of tribal enrollment, without family to vouch for me." She trailed off. "So you've been alone all this time?" Dawn nodded. "I lived in the desert, mostly. Moved from place to place. My grandmother taught me how to survive, but I was getting weak, getting careless. That's how the sheriff found me." Samuel felt a deep respect for this young woman who had survived alone in one of the harshest environments on earth. Sustained by traditional knowledge and sheer determination. "You don't have to be alone anymore," he said quietly. "Not unless you want to be." Dawn looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me, don't know my people." Samuel considered the question, one that had occurred to him many times over the past weeks. "Maybe because I understand what it's like to lose everything you care about. Maybe because this ranch is too big for one person, and you make it feel less empty." He paused, then added, "Or maybe because it's just the right thing to do." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Hayes arrived just after sunrise, her official car kicking up a cloud of dust as it approached the ranch house. Samuel met her on the porch, Dawn hovering uncertainly in the doorway behind him. "Mr. Crick," Dr. Hayes said, removing her sunglasses and wiping them on her shirt. "I have some news about Dawn's situation." Samuel noticed that she used the name without hesitation, which somehow pleased him. "We've been working with the tribal council, trying to locate family members or establish her documentation," Dr. Hayes continued. "It's been ... challenging. The mining incident disrupted a lot of records. And frankly, the federal bureaucracy isn't set up to handle cases like this efficiently." Dawn stepped forward, her expression guarded. "What does that mean?" Dr. Hayes looked between them, her expression thoughtful. "It means you're in a kind of legal limbo. We can't force you to go to the reservation without proper documentation, but we also can't officially recognize your status as a ward of the state without it." "So she can stay here?" Samuel asked. "For now, yes. But there are conditions." Dr. Hayes pulled out a folder from her briefcase. "We need to establish some kind of formal arrangement. Guardianship, or at least temporary custody. And Dawn needs to be enrolled in school for the fall term." Dawn's eyes widened with what looked like panic. "School?" Samuel stepped closer to her, offering silent support. "What kind of school?" "The Indian boarding school in Phoenix would be the usual placement," Dr. Hayes said, then quickly added, "But given the circumstances, we might be able to arrange for her to attend the local school in Copper Ridge. It would mean a long commute. But ... I could drive her," Samuel said without hesitation. "Every day if necessary." Dr. Hayes smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Samuel had seen from her. That could work. It would certainly be better for her adjustment. Dawn looked between them, uncertainty written across her features. Samuel realized that for someone who had been stripped of all control over her circumstances, the idea of more change, more strangers, more institutions, must feel overwhelming. "We don't have to decide everything today," he said gently. "But, Dawn, you're smart, and you deserve an education. And you won't have to face it alone." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky, Dawn spoke quietly. Asterisk in my language, my real name means she who watches the stars. She glanced at Samuel. "My grandmother chose it because I was born during a meteor shower. She said I would always find my way, no matter how lost I became." Samuel felt honored that she had shared this with him. "It's a beautiful name. A strong name. But Dawn is good too," she said, surprising him. "It means beginning. Starting over. Maybe that's what I need right now." As they prepared for bed, Samuel realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer stranger and refugee, host and guest. They were becoming something like family, to people who had found in each other a reason to keep moving forward. The desert night wrapped around them, vast and star-filled, holding infinite possibilities for tomorrow. Facing challenges and growing stronger. August brought challenges that tested the fragile stability Dawn and Samuel had built together. The first came in the form of gossip, spreading through Copper Ridge whispers, about the rancher living alone with a young Indian girl. Speculation about impropriety that made Samuel's jaw clench with anger. The second challenge arrived with the Indian Agency's monthly check-in, this time conducted by a stern man named Robert Morrison, who clearly disapproved of the entire arrangement. "This is highly irregular," Morrison said, standing stiffly in Samuel's living room, his clipboard clutched like a weapon. A single man, no family connections, no formal training in cultural sensitivity or child welfare. Dawn sat at the kitchen table, ostensibly reading, but clearly listening to every word. Samuel could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the book too tightly. "She's not some exotic pet that needs special handling," Samuel said, his voice carefully controlled. "She's a smart, capable young woman who's been through hell and needs stability." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "That's exactly the kind of attitude that concerns us. Mr. Creek, you clearly don't understand the complexities of maintaining cultural identity. The importance of connecting her with her tribal heritage. Her tribal heritage died in a mining accident," Samuel shot back, "along with everyone who could have taught it to her. There are other Apache communities, proper educational programs designed specifically to strip away everything that makes her who she is." Samuel interrupted. "I've heard about those programs. About children who go in speaking their language and come out ashamed of it." The argument might have escalated further, but Dawn suddenly appeared in the doorway, her chin raised in a gesture of quiet defiance that reminded Samuel of her first day on the ranch. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice clear and steady, "may I ask you something?" Morrison looked surprised, but nodded. "Do you speak Apache? Any dialect?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Well, no, but do you know which plants can cure a fever? Or how to find water in the desert? Or the stories my grandmother told about why the mountains have the shapes they do?" "That's not really the point." "It is exactly the point," Dawn said, stepping fully into the room. "You want to preserve my culture, but you don't know what my culture is. You want to connect me with my heritage, but you're talking about shipping me off to live with people I've never met, in a place I've never been." She gestured toward Samuel. "This man doesn't know my language either, but he listens when I teach him words. He doesn't know my grandmother's stories, but he asks me to tell them. He doesn't know Apache customs, but he respects them when I explain them." Morrison's face had gone red. "Young lady, you don't understand the broader implications." "I understand that I'm not a problem to be solved," Dawn said firmly. "I'm a person trying to build a life. And for the first time since my family died, I feel like I might actually have a chance to do that." The confrontation ended with Morrison's departure and a promise to review the situation with his superiors. Samuel and Dawn stood at the window, watching his car disappear in a cloud of dust. "That was brave," Samuel said quietly. Dawn shrugged, but he could see she was shaking slightly from the adrenaline. "My grandmother always said that if you don't speak for yourself, no one else will do it right." The third challenge came from an unexpected source. Samuel's own family. His sister Helen arrived unannounced from Phoenix, her disapproval radiating from her like heat from the desert pavement. "Samuel Creek, what in God's name are you thinking?" she demanded, standing in the middle of his living room with her hands on her hips. "The whole family is talking about this situation. People are asking questions." Samuel poured himself a cup of coffee with deliberate calm. "What kind of questions?" "You know exactly what kind," Helen snapped. "A middle-aged widower, living alone with a teenage girl. It doesn't look right, Sam. It doesn't look right at all." Dawn had retreated to her room when Helen arrived, but Samuel was certain she could hear every word of this confrontation too. "I don't much care how it looks," Samuel said evenly. "I care about doing what's right." "What's right is finding proper placement for her with her own people," Helen retorted, "not playing house with some Indian girl you picked up off the street." Samuel's coffee cup hit the table with enough force to slosh liquid over the rim. "Don't you ever talk about her like that again." Helen stepped back, clearly startled by the intensity of his reaction. "She has a name," Samuel continued, his voice low and dangerous. "She has a story, and feelings, and more courage in her little finger than most people have in their whole bodies. She survived things that would have broken weaker people, and she's trying to build something good out of the wreckage of her life." "Sam, no. Helen, you listen to me. Martha and I tried for 15 years to have children. 15 years of hoping and disappointment, and eventually accepting that it wasn't going to happen. Now, when I finally have a chance to make a difference in a young person's life, you want me to walk away because some small-minded people might gossip. Helen's expression softened slightly. I just don't want to see you get hurt. Or her, either. This can't last forever, Sam. She's going to grow up, want her own life. Of course she is, Samuel said. And when that time comes, I'll help her build it. But right now, she needs someone to believe in her, to give her a foundation to build. From Clet's that evening, after Helen had left with a grudging promise to try to understand, Samuel found Dawn sitting on the porch, staring out at the desert. Heard all that, did you? He asked, settling into the chair beside her. She nodded. Is it true? Do people really think bad things about you helping me? Samuel sighed. Some people will always find something to criticize. The question is whether you let their small-mindedness dictate your choices. Dawn was quiet for a long moment. Maybe I should go, she said finally. To the reservation or the boarding school. I don't want to cause trouble for you. Samuel felt a sharp pain in his chest at the thought of her leaving. Over the past 2 months, she had become more than just a guest in his house. She had become family in all the ways that mattered. The only trouble you'd cause me, he said carefully, is if you left because of what other people think instead of what you want. She turned to look at him, her dark eyes serious. What I want is to stay here. To help with the ranch. To learn to read better. To maybe go to that school in Copper Ridge if I'm brave enough. Is that ... Is that what you want? Too. Samuel felt something loosen in his chest. A tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. More than anything, he said honestly. Dawn smiled. Then the first truly joyful expression he had seen from her since that first day. Then we'll face whatever comes together. Like family does. As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, Samuel realized that in helping Dawn find her place in the world, he had found his own purpose again. The ranch no longer felt like a lonely outpost, felt like home. The desert wind whispered through the mesquite, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of rain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, they were exactly where they belonged. Finding home and new beginning September arrived with cooler mornings and the promise of change. Dawn's enrollment at Copper Ridge High School had been finalized, despite some resistance from parents who questioned whether an Indian girl belonged in their classroom. Samuel spent the week before school started helping her prepare supplies, practicing the long drive into town, and addressing her anxiety about entering a world so different from anything she had known. What if they hate me? Dawn asked on the morning of her first day, standing before the small mirror in her room. She wore a simple blue dress that Helen had grudgingly purchased during a trip to Phoenix, her long black hair braided neatly down her back. Samuel leaned against the doorframe, struck by how young she looked despite everything she had endured. Some might, he said honestly. But others will see what I see, someone smart and strong and worth knowing. The drive to Copper Ridge took 45 minutes across desert roads that shimmered in the early morning heat. Dawn sat silently beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring out at the landscape she now knew as well as her own heartbeat. Copper Ridge High School was a low, adobe building that served farm and ranch families scattered across hundreds of square miles. The parking area was filled with pickup trucks and a few tired-looking cars. Students clustered in small groups, their conversations creating a low buzz that fell silent as Samuel's truck pulled up. You don't have to do this, Samuel said quietly. There are other options. Dawn took a deep breath, then opened the truck door. Yes, I do. If I'm going to make a life here, I need to start somewhere. Samuel watched her walk toward the school, building her spine straight and her step determined. Several students stared openly, some with curiosity, others with less welcoming expressions. But Dawn didn't waver, even when a group of boys made comments just loud enough for her to hear. The first weeks were difficult. Dawn came home each day exhausted, not just from the academic work, but from the constant effort of navigating social dynamics that were foreign to her. Some teachers were kind and patient. Others seemed determined to prove she didn't belong. A few students showed genuine interest in befriending her, but many kept their distance, influenced by parents who viewed her presence as an unwelcome intrusion. It was during the third week that the situation came to a head. Samuel was repairing equipment in the barn when he heard his truck approaching much earlier than expected. Dawn climbed out slowly, her dress torn and mud-stained, her face set in lines of controlled fury. What happened? Samuel asked, dropping his tools and moving toward her. Some boys decided to test whether Indians can really track, she said, her voice tight with anger. They took my books and scattered them in the desert behind the school. Said if I was so good at finding things, I should be able to find them. Samuel felt rage building in his chest. Did you tell a teacher? Don's laugh held no humor. I told Mr. Peterson, he said maybe it would be a good learning experience, help me develop resourcefulness. Did you find the books? Every single one, Don said with grim satisfaction. Found them faster than they expected. But that's not the point. Samuel studied her face, recognizing something new in her expression. Not just anger, but a kind of steel resolve he hadn't seen before. What is the point? He asked. The point is that I'm tired of proving I belong somewhere. Tired of making myself smaller so other people feel comfortable. She looked up at him. I want to do something that matters. Something that uses what I know, instead of pretending it doesn't exist. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Dawn outlined an idea that had been forming in her mind. There are plants in this desert that can heal things, she said. Plants my grandmother taught me about that most people don't know exist. What if, what if I could teach people? Not just Apache people, but ranchers and farmers who live out here and need to know how to take care of themselves when they're far from doctors. Samuel leaned forward, intrigued. Go on. I could finish school, maybe even go to college to study botany or medicine. But I could also start sharing the knowledge I already have, write it down, teach classes, maybe even grow some of the important plants so they don't disappear when the old people die. The more she talked, the more animated she became, her eyes bright with possibility. Samuel found himself caught up in her vision, a way to honor her grandmother's legacy, while building a bridge between two worlds. It's a good idea, he said. An important idea. But it would take time, and resources, and probably a lot of people telling you it won't work. Dawn smiled, and Samuel was struck by how much she had changed since that first silent arrival. I've got time, and I've got someone who believes in me. That's more than a lot of people start with. Over the following months, Dawn's life took on a new rhythm. She continued attending school, but she also began documenting her grandmother's knowledge, in careful notebooks, sketching plants and recording their uses. On weekends, she and Samuel would ride out into the desert, collecting specimens and teaching him to see the landscape through Apache eyes. Word of her project began to spread through the ranching community. Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had been treating a persistent cough with expensive medicine from town, was the first to ask for help. Dawn prepared a tea from desert willow that cleared the cough within days. Soon, other ranchers were quietly asking for advice, then openly seeking her knowledge. The breakthrough came in November, when Dawn successfully treated a case of infection that had resisted conventional medicine. Dr. Miller from Copper Ridge, initially skeptical, became genuinely interested in her methods. He began referring patients to her for certain conditions, creating an informal partnership that raised eyebrows but produced undeniable results. You're going to need a proper laboratory, Dr. Miller told her during one of his visits to the ranch, and formal training in pharmacology, if you want to take this seriously. Dawn looked at Samuel, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway. What do you think? Samuel felt a mixture of pride and trepidation. The girl who had arrived silent and broken was becoming a young woman with purpose and vision. Her future was beginning to take shape, and it was bigger than anything he had imagined. I think, he said carefully, that you should do whatever makes you feel most alive. That winter brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Hayes returned, but this time she wasn't alone. With her was an elderly Apache woman named Rose Begay, her face weathered by decades of desert sun, but her eyes sharp and alert. Dawn, Dr. Hayes said, I'd like you to meet Mrs. Begay. She's been searching for you for a very long time. Dawn froze in the doorway, her face cycling through confusion, hope, and fear. Rose Begay stepped forward, her movements careful, but purposeful. Child, the elderly woman said in accented English, then switched to Apache, speaking words that Samuel couldn't understand, but recognized as deeply emotional. Dawn's response came in the same language, hesitant at first, then flowing more freely. Tears began to track down both women's faces as they spoke, and Samuel felt like an intruder, witnessing something sacred. Finally, Rose turned to Samuel, her expression grave but not unkind. You are the man who gave my great-niece a home when she had nowhere to go. Samuel felt the ground shift beneath him. Greatness, family, the word he had both hoped for and dreaded, rescue or separation. He couldn't tell which. She told me what you've done, Rose continued. How you've cared for her, protected her, helped her find her path. This is not a small thing. Dawn stepped closer to Samuel, her hand finding his arm in a gesture that had become natural over the months. Aunt Rose, she said in English, Samuel is family too. He saved my life. Rose studied Samuel with the kind of penetrating gaze that seemed to see past surface appearances to something deeper. I can see that, she said finally. The question is, what happens now? Over dinner, the story emerged in fragments. Rose had been traveling, visiting distant relatives, when the mining disaster occurred. By the time she returned and learned what had happened, Dawn had disappeared. She had spent months following false leads and dead ends, working with tribal councils and government agencies to track down her missing great niece. I came to take you home, Rose said to Dawn. Back to our people, where you belong. Samuel felt his heart clench, but he kept his expression neutral. This was Dawn's choice to make, and he would support whatever decision she reached, even if it meant losing her. Dawn was quiet for a long time, her food growing cold as she wrestled with emotions Samuel could only imagine. Finally, she looked up at her great aunt. Where is home? She asked. The place where I was born is gone. The people who raised me are dead. I've learned to belong here, learned to build something new from what's left. Rose's expression softened. Home is where your people are, child. Where your blood connects you to something larger than yourself. But what if my people are more than just blood? Dawn asked. What if family is also the person who took me in when I had nothing, who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself? Samuel felt tears prick his eyes, but he remained silent. This was Dawn's moment, her choice to make. Rose looked between Dawn and Samuel, her weathered face thoughtful. Tell me about this life you've built, she said. Dawn began to speak, her voice growing stronger as she described her school, her work documenting traditional plant knowledge, her growing reputation as a healer. She talked about her plans for the future, her dreams of bridging two worlds through medicine and education. And this man? Rose asked, nodding toward Samuel. What role does he play in these dreams? Dawn's hand found Samuel's across the table. He's the father I lost, the teacher I needed, the friend who stood by me when everyone else doubted. He's the person who taught me that family isn't just about where you come from. It's about who stands with you when you're building where you're going. Rose was quiet for a long time, her gaze moving between Dawn and Samuel, taking in the easy familiarity between them, the way they seemed to communicate without words. I came here expecting to find a lost child, she said finally. Instead, I find a young woman who has found her path. Perhaps home can be larger than I thought. The conversation continued late into the night, with Rose sharing stories of Dawn's mother as a child, filling in pieces of family history that had been lost in the tragedy. Dawn listened hungrily, her connection to her heritage reset itself through her great-aunt's words. But as the evening progressed, it became clear that Rose wasn't trying to pull Dawn away from the life she had built. Instead, she was offering something different to bridge back to her Apache identity that didn't require abandoning everything else she had become. There is a place for you with our people, Rose said. Always. But I can see that you have found your place here as well. Perhaps the spirits knew what they were doing when they brought you to this man's door. When Dr. Hayes and Rose prepared to leave the next morning, it was with an understanding that Dawn would remain at the ranch. But it was also with plans for Dawn to visit Rose's community during school breaks, to learn more about her heritage and to share her knowledge with Apache healers who were also working to preserve traditional medicine. You will always be Apache, Rose told Dawn as they embraced. But you will also be something newer, bridge between worlds. Your grandmother would be proud. After the visitors left, Samuel and Dawn stood on the porch, watching the dust settle. In their wake, the desert stretched around them, vast and familiar, holding all the challenges and possibilities of the future. Any regrets? Samuel asked quietly. Dawn considered the question seriously. About staying? No. About the path that brought me here. I wish my family hadn't died. Wish I hadn't had to go through so much pain to find this place. But I can't regret what we've built together. Samuel nodded, understanding. Martha used to say that sometimes the worst things that happen to us clear the ground for the best things to grow. Wise woman, Dawn said. I wish I could have known her. You do know her, in a way, Samuel said. This was her dream to a house full of life and purpose and love. You made that dream come true. As spring arrived, Dawn's 18th birthday brought new possibilities. She had been accepted to the University of Arizona to study botany, with a scholarship that would allow her to continue her research into traditional medicine. But she would continue to live at the ranch, commuting to Tucson for classes, and returning home to the desert that had shaped her. The ranch itself was changing too. A small greenhouse had been built behind the house, where Dawn cultivated medicinal plants and conducted experiments. A steady stream of visitors came seeking her knowledge. Ranchers, doctors, researchers, and Apache people from other communities who had heard about her work. Samuel found himself busier than he had been in years, helping Dawn with her projects while continuing to run his cattle operation. The loneliness that had defined his life after Martha's death was now just a memory, replaced by the daily satisfactions of shared purpose and mutual support. On the evening before Dawn left for her first semester at university, they sat on the porch as they had so many times before, watching the desert paint itself in shades of gold and purple as the sun set behind the mountains. Nervous? Samuel asked. Dawn smiled, her confidence evident in the set of her shoulders. Excited, ready to learn everything I can so I can come back and do more good here. Here will always be home. Here will always be home, she confirmed. This place, this family we've built. It's the foundation everything else grows from. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The silent, broken girl who had arrived 18 months ago had become a confident young woman with a clear vision for her future. She had found her voice, her purpose, and her place in the world. More importantly, she had helped him find his own purpose again. The ranch was no longer just a place where he waited for time to pass. It was a home where healing happened, where knowledge was preserved, where two people from different worlds had created something beautiful together. Thank you, Dawn said. Suddenly, her voice soft in the desert silence. For what? For giving me a name when I couldn't speak my own. For seeing who I could become before I could see it myself. For showing me that family is something you build, not just something you're born with. Samuel felt tears sting his eyes. Thank you for giving an old rancher a reason to believe in tomorrow again. The desert wind whispered through the mesquite, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of rain. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, a sound that no longer seemed lonely, but rather like a celebration of connection across the vast spaces. Dawn had refused to speak her name until the lonely rancher gave her a new one. In the end, they had given each other something far more valuable than names. They had given each other the chance to become who they were meant to be. As they prepared for bed, Samuel realized that tomorrow would bring the next chapter of their story. Dawn would go to university, expand her knowledge, build her reputation as a healer and bridge builder between cultures. The ranch would continue to be a place of refuge and growth, welcoming others who needed a chance to start over. The girl who had arrived silent and broken had found her voice. The lonely rancher had found his family. And in the vast desert that had witnessed both their pain and their healing, they had created something that would endure, a home built not on loss, but on the courage to love again. The stars wheeled, overhead, infinite and eternal, watching over a story that had begun with ending and bloomed into a beginning that would echo through generations yet to come.